David Morrison was 41 years old and earning $68,000 a year as a freelance software consultant when he stood in the ballroom of the Riverside Marriott on the evening of March 15, 2024, watching his wife's boss humiliate him in front of 200 people, completely unaware that David had quietly purchased the controlling shares of Morrison Tech Solutions for $47 million 6 months earlier. The check from his late uncle's estate, which had cleared on September 8, 2023, had been sitting in an account at Wells Fargo, accumulating interest while David decided exactly how to handle the company that bore his family's name, but had been stolen from them 30 years ago. "Let me get this straight," Richard Hastings announced loudly, his $3,200 Tom Ford suit catching the chandelier light as he grabbed another champagne flute from the passing server. "Jennifer's husband here does what? Fixes computers from home?" The laughter rippled through the crowd of executives and senior managers, all celebrating Jennifer's promotion to Vice President of Operations, a position that came with a $215,000 salary and the corner office on the 18th floor of the downtown Seattle headquarters. David felt Jennifer's hand tighten on his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his $89 Macy's blazer. He could see the flush creeping up her neck, the same one that appeared whenever she was caught between defending him and protecting her career. After 12 years of marriage, he knew exactly which one she'd choose. She always did. "David's a software consultant, Richard," Jennifer said quietly, her voice barely audible over the string quartet playing near the marble fountain that dominated the center of the ballroom. "He works with several clients." "Oh, a consultant," Richard interrupted, drawing out the word like it was something distasteful he'd found on his shoe. "Is that what we're calling unemployed these days? No offense, Dave, but when your wife's pulling down over 200 grand and you're making what, 60, 70,000? Maybe it's time to admit who's really supporting this marriage." He turned to Jennifer with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Jen, honey, you really should consider upgrading. A woman of your caliber, your position, you deserve someone who matches your success level." The circle of executives around them, Michael Chen from accounting, who drove the $140,000 Mercedes S-Class, Patricia Thornton from legal, who just purchased the $2.8 million condo in Belltown, Gregory Walsh from sales, who lost reminding everyone about his MBA from Stanford. They all smiled and nodded. Some looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. They never did. The corporate hierarchy at Morrison Tech was clear. Richard Hastings was the CEO, pulling down $890,000 a year, plus stock options worth another $3 million. And what Richard said was law. David had heard it all before. At the company Christmas party at the Columbia Tower Club, where Richard had questioned why Jennifer even brought him. At the 4th of July executive retreat in the San Juan Islands, where Richard had, jokingly, suggested Jennifer needed a real man. At the quarterly dinner at Canlis Restaurant on Queen Anne Hill, where Richard had asked David if he felt emasculated by his wife's success. 12 times over the past 2 years, David had counted. 12 public humiliations, each one a little worse than the last. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom knew except David's lawyer, Marcus Chen, at Pemberton and Associates, and his financial advisor, Sarah Williams, at Seattle Wealth Management, was that on September 8, 2023, David had inherited $52 million from his uncle, Thomas Morrison. Thomas, who had been quietly buying up shares of Morrison Tech Solutions for the past 15 years. Thomas, who had watched his younger brother, David's father, get forced out of the company they'd founded together in 1994. Thomas, who had spent 3 decades gathering evidence, building alliances, and positioning his nephew to take back what the Morrison family had lost. The paperwork sat in David's home office in their Maple Leaf neighborhood house, the one they'd purchased for $675,000 3 years ago, with Jennifer's income qualifying them for the mortgage. 51% controlling interest in Morrison Tech Solutions. Purchase price, $47 million, completed through a shell corporation called Pacific Northwest Holdings on September 22, 2023. The board of directors didn't even know who owned it. The quarterly reports went to a P.O. box in Bellevue. The voting proxies had been assigned to a third-party management firm. "You know what, Richard?" David said quietly, his voice cutting through the laughter. "You're absolutely right. Jennifer deserves better." Jennifer's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with panic. She knew that tone. That was the tone he used when he was done, when he'd reached the limit of what he could tolerate. "David, don't—" "No, he's right," David continued, looking directly at Richard. "She deserves to work for a company that values her contributions, that treats her with respect, that doesn't make her feel like she has to choose between her marriage and her career. She deserves a CEO who leads with integrity instead of bullying and intimidation. She deserves to work somewhere that actually lives up to the values it claims in its mission statement." If you enjoy stories like this one of corporate justice and watching arrogant executives get exactly what they deserve, like this video and subscribe to the channel now. There are brand new stories here every day, each one more intense than the last. And tell me where you are watching from. The smile had vanished from Richard's face, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "Careful, Dave. You might want to remember that your wife works for me. That corner office she just got? I can take it away just as easily as I gave it. Maybe she'd be happier back in her old cubicle in the operations bullpen. Maybe she'd be happier updating spreadsheets instead of managing a $15 million departmental budget." "Richard, please," Jennifer whispered, and David heard the desperation in her voice. She'd worked so hard for this promotion, put in 70-hour weeks for the past 6 months, sacrificed weekends and anniversaries and their vacation to Maui they'd been planning for 2 years. She'd earned that corner office, earned that salary, earned the respect of her team, and Richard was threatening to destroy it all because David had finally stood up to him. "It's okay, Jen," David said softly, and he meant it, because in his briefcase, in their home office, in the files Marcus Chen had prepared, he had everything he needed: employment contracts, documentation of hostile work environment complaints that had been buried, evidence of Richard's affair with the former CFO that had cost the company $4.7 million in a settlement, records of the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands where Richard had been funneling consulting fees from shell companies he'd created. 7 years of financial irregularities that Thomas Morrison had documented before his death from cancer on August 15, 2023. The letter from Thomas had been waiting in the safe deposit box at Bank of America, the one David had opened with the key his uncle had left him. The letter that explained everything: how Thomas had never married, never had children, had spent his entire adult life building his fortune through smart investments in real estate, all so he could give his nephew the tools to take back what was stolen from the Morrison family. How Richard Hastings had systematically driven out every Morrison family member from the company's leadership over the past decade. How the company that should have been David's birthright had been turned into Richard's personal empire. "You want to know what I really do, Richard?" David asked, and something in his voice made the circle around them go quiet. The string quartet seemed to fade into the background. Even the crystal chandelier's light seemed to sharpen, to focus on this moment. "I spend my days reviewing financial statements, analyzing corporate governance structures, consulting with attorneys about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder rights. I've gotten very good at it over the past 6 months." Richard laughed, but it sounded forced now. "What are you babbling about? Jennifer, get your husband under control before he embarrasses you any further." "I'm talking about Morrison Tech Solutions," David said calmly. "Founded in 1994 by Thomas Morrison and Robert Morrison, my uncle and my father. Grown to $340 million in annual revenue by 2000. My father was forced out in 2001 after you convinced the board he was mentally unstable. You remember that, don't you, Richard? The psychiatric evaluation you paid Dr. Kenneth Brandt $75,000 to falsify. The one that claimed my father was having paranoid delusions about financial improprieties. The color had drained from Richard's face. How do you? That's confidential medical information. You can't possibly. My father died in 2008, David continued, his voice steady despite the rage that had been building for 16 years. Heart attack at 52 years old. Stress-related, the doctor said. He spent 7 years fighting to clear his name, spent every penny he had on lawyers who couldn't prove what we all knew was true. He died broke, humiliated, destroyed by the lies you told. And my Uncle Thomas? He spent the next 15 years making sure you'd pay for it. Jennifer had let go of his arm. She was staring at him like she'd never seen him before. David, what are you talking about? What's going on? I'm talking about justice, Jen, David said quietly. I'm talking about the fact that on September 22nd, 2023, a company called Pacific Northwest Holdings purchased 51% of Morrison Tech Solutions' outstanding shares for $47 million. I'm talking about the fact that I own the controlling interest in this company. I own the board seats. I own the voting rights. I own Richard Hastings' career, his reputation, and his future. And on Monday morning, March 18th, at 9 a.m. in the Morrison Tech conference room, the board of directors is going to receive a very detailed presentation about the past 7 years of financial irregularities, ethics violations, and fraud that have been committed under Richard's leadership. The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. 200 people, frozen in place, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations dying mid-sentence. Patricia Thornton from legal had pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. Michael Chen from accounting looked like he might be sick. Gregory Walsh had actually taken a step backward, distancing himself from Richard like the man had suddenly become radioactive. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His face had gone from pale to red, a vein pulsing at his temple. You're lying. This is some kind of sick fantasy. Pacific Northwest Holdings, David repeated, registered in Delaware on September 15th, 2023. Managing member, David Anthony Morrison. Check it yourself, Richard. Call your lawyers. Call your accountant. Better yet, check your email. Marcus Chen from Pemberton and Associates sent the board of directors a notification letter at 5 p.m. this evening. You should have it in your inbox right now. Richard fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. The executives around them were doing the same, pulling out their devices, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of screens. David watched as Richard's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, recognition, horror. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, David said softly, addressing the crowd now. The shell companies that funnel consulting fees while providing no actual services. The affair with former CFO Sandra Reeves that cost this company $4.7 million in a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. The hostile work environment complaints that were buried instead of investigated. The retaliation against employees who question your decisions. The shareholder funds used for personal expenses. The $280,000 renovation to your Mercer Island estate. The $95,000 for your daughter's wedding at the Seattle Yacht Club. The $43,000 in charges to escort services masked as client entertainment expenses. Jesus Christ, Michael Chen whispered. Several people had started moving toward the exits. The bartenders had stopped serving. The string quartet had given up any pretense of playing. Monday morning, David continued, the board will vote on your termination as CEO. They'll vote on the appointment of an interim executive team to conduct a full financial audit. They'll vote on whether to refer the findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the King County Prosecutor's Office. And Jennifer, he turned to his wife, who had tears streaming down her face, they'll vote on whether to offer you the position of acting CEO while we search for Richard's permanent replacement. Because despite everything, despite having to watch your husband be humiliated month after month while you stayed silent, you're actually good at your job. You've earned that corner office. You've earned the respect of your team, and you've earned the chance to lead this company the right way. Jennifer was staring at him like he was a stranger. You knew, she whispered. All this time you knew you owned the company, and you let him. You let me. Her voice broke. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to know, David said quietly. I needed to know if you'd stand up for me without knowing I had the power to protect you. I needed to know if our marriage meant more to you than your career. If you'd defend me when it cost you something. If you loved me enough to risk Richard's anger. He paused, watching her face crumble as she understood what he was saying. And I got my answer, Jen. I got my answer every single time you stood there and let him humiliate me. Every time you chose silence. Every time you squeezed my arm and whispered for me to just let it go, to not make a scene, to think about your career. David, please, I was trying to protect us, to protect our future. You were protecting yourself, David said, and there was no anger in his voice anymore, just a deep, aching sadness that had been growing for 2 years. You were protecting your salary, your title, your status, and I understand why. I really do. This world is hard for women in corporate America. You've had to fight twice as hard as any man for half the recognition. You've had to smile through condescending comments and inappropriate jokes and being talked over in meetings. I know you've earned everything you have, but marriage is supposed to be a partnership, Jen. We're supposed to have each other's backs. And when it mattered most, you didn't have mine. Richard had found his voice again, though it came out strangled, desperate. This is corporate espionage. This is, I'll sue you for every penny. With what money, Richard? David asked, genuinely curious. The salary that's about to end? The stock options that will be worthless once the SEC investigation reveals the actual financial state of this company? The offshore accounts that are about to be frozen by federal authorities? I've already provided documentation to the IRS about the $12 million in unreported income you've moved through those Cayman accounts over the past 5 years. They're very interested in talking to you. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel if you have not, because the ending of this story will blow your mind. And drop a comment below telling me what you think David should do next. Should he give Jennifer another chance? Or is this marriage over? Richard's phone rang, the sound cutting through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. He looked at the screen, and whatever he saw there made his face go gray. It's Gerald Whitmore, he said hoarsely. Gerald Whitmore, the chairman of Morrison Tech's board of directors, the man who'd been Thomas Morrison's college roommate at the University of Washington, who'd watched helplessly as Richard consolidated power and pushed out the Morrison family. He's calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Actually, that was my suggestion, David said. I thought we shouldn't wait until Monday. Why drag this out? The evidence is overwhelming, Richard. 7 years of documentation, bank records, email trails, testimony from 12 current and former employees about the hostile work environment, medical records from Jennifer's stress-related health issues, the anxiety medication she started taking last year, the therapy appointments she hides from you because she's afraid it makes her look weak. Sandra Reeves is willing to testify about the affair and the pressure you put on her to keep quiet. The forensic accounting firm of Deloitte and Touche has already begun their preliminary review of the financials. Richard was shaking now, his expensive suit rumpled, his face slick with sweat despite the ballroom's air conditioning. You've destroyed me, he whispered. You've destroyed my career, my reputation. No, Richard, David corrected gently. You destroyed yourself. You destroyed my father. You've been destroying this company for years, bleeding it dry while the employees who actually do the work struggle to get fair raises and benefits. I'm just making sure everyone finally sees what you really are. The executives were filing out now, a steady stream of designer suits and uncomfortable expressions. Patricia Thornton paused near David, her voice low. For what it's worth, I tried to tell the board about some of this 2 years ago. Richard had me demoted to junior counsel for it, took away my corner office, cut my salary by $40,000. I'm glad someone finally had the power to stop him. David nodded, watching as the ballroom emptied. The catering staff was starting to clear the untouched hors d'oeuvres, the expensive champagne, the celebration that had turned into a funeral for Richard Hastings' career. The string quartet packed up their instruments, the violinist giving David a small smile as she passed. Jennifer stood alone in the center of the ballroom, still in her $800 Nordstrom dress, her promotion celebration in ruins around her. "What happens to me now?" she asked quietly. "That's up to you, Jen," David said. "The board will offer you the acting CEO position on Monday. You can accept it or decline it. You can stay with the company or leave. You can work to reform the culture Richard created, or you can walk away. It's your choice. It's always been your choice." "And us?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What happens to our marriage?" David looked at the woman he'd loved since they met at a coffee shop in the University District 13 years ago. The woman who'd convinced him to take a chance on love, even though he'd been burned before. The woman who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral and promised they'd face everything together. He looked at her and saw the moment she'd chosen her career over defending him. The moment she'd squeezed his arm and warned him to be quiet. The moment she'd let Richard Hastings humiliate him one more time. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I really don't know." The emergency board meeting took place at 8 a.m. on Saturday, March 16th, in the Morrison Tech Solutions conference room on the 20th floor of the Columbia Center. David arrived at 7:30, carrying a leather briefcase that his Uncle Thomas had left him, along with everything else. Inside were printed copies of 7 years of financial records, witness statements, and email correspondence that would systematically dismantle Richard Hastings' empire. Marcus Chen was already there, setting up the presentation equipment. At 54 years old, Marcus had been Thomas Morrison's attorney for 20 years and had spent the last 6 months of Thomas's life preparing this exact moment. The board members started arriving at 7, Marcus said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Gerald Whitmore looks like he's aged 10 years overnight. Richard showed up at 6:45 with Lawrence Patel from Hoffman and Associates. They're criminal defense attorneys, David. He's lawyered up already. "Good," David said quietly, taking a seat at the head of the long mahogany table. The same table where his father had once sat, before Richard had orchestrated his removal. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Seattle spread out below them. The Space Needle, Elliott Bay, the ferries crossing to Bainbridge Island. His father had loved this view. Thomas had told him that Robert Morrison used to arrive early just to watch the sunrise over the Cascade Mountains. The board members filed in at 7:55. Gerald Whitmore, 67 years old, CEO of Whitmore Consulting, worth approximately $23 million. Margaret Sato, 59, former COO of Microsoft, board member of 3 other tech companies. James Brennan, 52, venture capitalist whose firm had invested $8 million in Morrison Tech's Series C funding round in 2015. Catherine Lloyd, 61, whose career in corporate law spanned 4 decades. And Richard Hastings, flanked by his attorney Lawrence Patel, looking like he hadn't slept at all. "This is highly irregular," Patel began immediately. "Calling an emergency board meeting on a Saturday morning without proper notice. The bylaws allow for emergency meetings with 12 hours notice when circumstances warrant immediate action," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "All board members were notified via email at 5 p.m. yesterday. We're well within the legal requirements, Mr. Patel." Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something else. Relief maybe, or vindication. "Let's get started. David Morrison has invoked his rights as majority shareholder to address the board. The floor is yours, David." David stood, feeling the weight of 16 years. The 16 years since his father's forced removal, pressing down on his shoulders. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Members of the board, I'm here today because this company was founded by my uncle, Thomas Morrison, and my father, Robert Morrison, in 1994. It was built on principles of integrity, innovation, and respect for the people who make technology work. Those principles have been systematically violated over the past 7 years under Richard Hastings' leadership, and I have evidence of criminal conduct that cannot be ignored. This is a witch hunt, Richard said, his voice sharp despite the dark circles under his eyes. This is personal revenge for— Let him present his evidence, Richard, Margaret Sato said coldly. Then you'll have your chance to respond. David opened the briefcase and began distributing folders. Each of you now has a summary of findings compiled by forensic accountants at Deloitte and Touche, along with supporting documentation. I'll walk you through the key points. The projector screen behind him lit up with the first slide, a spreadsheet showing offshore transfers. Between January 2018 and December 2024, Richard Hastings transferred $12.3 million from Morrison Tech Solutions to 3 shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands: Hastings Consulting Group, Strategic Solutions International, and Tech Vision Advisors. These companies provided no actual services to Morrison Tech. They exist solely to funnel money into Richard's personal accounts. James Brennan was already flipping through the documents, his face darkening. These consulting fees, $175,000 to Strategic Solutions in March 2021 for market analysis research. I remember questioning this expense. Richard told me it was a comprehensive competitive intelligence report. Did you ever see that report, Mr. Brennan? David asked. No, Richard said it was confidential, only for executive leadership review. That's because it doesn't exist, David said flatly. None of these reports exist. The shell companies have no employees, no office space, no deliverables. The money was simply transferred and then withdrawn by Richard through a series of intermediary accounts. He clicked to the next slide, showing bank statements. Wells Fargo, Grand Cayman Branch. Account holder, Richard James Hastings. The deposits match the consulting payments exactly, usually arriving within 72 hours of Morrison Tech's transfer. Catherine Lloyd was taking notes, her legal training evident in the precision of her questions. How did you obtain these banking records, Mr. Morrison? International bank accounts have strict privacy protections. My uncle Thomas Morrison was a patient man, David replied. When Richard forced my father out in 2001, Thomas began investigating. He hired private investigators, forensic accountants, former IRS agents. It took him 15 years, but he built an airtight case. Some of this information came from whistleblowers within the banks themselves, people who were disturbed by the obvious money laundering patterns. Some came from Richard's former assistant, Caroline Webster, who kept copies of suspicious transactions before Richard fired her in 2020 for refusing to falsify expense reports. And some came from Sandra Reeves, the former CFO who Richard had an affair with, and then paid $4.7 million to keep quiet. Richard shot to his feet. That's a lie. Sandra and I never. The settlement was for age discrimination, not— Sir, I need you to sit down, Lawrence Patel said urgently, grabbing his client's arm. Do not say another word. But David was already clicking to the next slide. Hotel receipts from the Four Seasons in Whistler, British Columbia, showing adjoining rooms booked under Richard Hastings and Sandra Reeves for a executive planning retreat in February 2019. Then photographs, not explicit but damning, of Richard and Sandra having dinner at Canlis, his hand over hers on the table. Text messages recovered from Sandra's phone, turned over as part of her cooperation agreement. Sandra Reeves has provided testimony to our attorneys, David continued. She's willing to testify that Richard pressured her into the relationship by suggesting her job security depended on her cooperation. When she tried to end it in 2020, Richard threatened to fire her and destroy her reputation in the industry. The $4.7 million settlement wasn't for age discrimination. It was to prevent a sexual harassment lawsuit that would have cost this company far more in reputation damage and legal fees. Margaret Sato looked physically ill. The board approved that settlement based on Richard's representation that it was a routine employment dispute. We were told there was no merit to any harassment claims. Richard lied to you, David said simply. He's been lying to this board for years, and the cost of those lies extends far beyond money. He clicked to a new section of the presentation. Hostile work environment complaints. In the past 7 years, 47 employees have filed formal complaints about Richard's behavior. Verbal abuse, retaliation, discrimination, harassment. The HR department, which reports directly to Richard, buried every single one. Employees who complained were transferred to less desirable positions, denied raises, or forced out entirely. That's standard HR management, Richard protested weakly. Sometimes complaints are unfounded. Jennifer Morrison's medical records, David interrupted, and he saw Richard go pale. My wife, your vice president of operations, started taking anxiety medication in November 2023. She sees a therapist twice a month for stress-related issues. Her blood pressure medication was increased in January 2024. She's 38 years old and healthy, but working under Richard Hastings has literally made her sick. He paused, letting that sink in. And she's one of the lucky ones. Patricia Thornton from legal had a panic attack in the office in 2022 that required an ambulance. Michael Chen from accounting has been on antidepressants for 3 years. Gregory Walsh from sales requested a transfer to the Austin office just to get away from Richard's management style. Gerald Whitmore was shaking his head slowly, his hands flat on the table. Thomas tried to tell me, he said quietly. 5 years ago, maybe 6, he came to me with concerns about Richard's leadership. I told him he was being paranoid, that he needed to let go of what happened with Robert. I didn't listen. He looked directly at David. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. I am enjoying this story, and tell us what you would have done in David's situation. The financial damage extends beyond Richard's personal theft, David continued, pulling the board's attention back to the presentation. Under his leadership, Morrison Tech has lost key clients due to his abrasive behavior and poor strategic decisions. In 2022, we lost the $15 million Microsoft contract because Richard insulted their procurement director at a negotiation meeting. In 2023, Amazon pulled their $8.2 million annual spend because Richard refused to address quality control issues that his own team had flagged. The Boeing contract, worth $22 million over 3 years, was not renewed because Richard's toxic reputation in the industry made them uncomfortable continuing the relationship. James Brennan had his head in his hands. That's $45 million in lost revenue. The financials Richard presented to the board showed those losses as market corrections and strategic repositioning. You're telling me it was just Richard being an asshole? Yes, David said bluntly, and it gets worse. The hostile work environment has driven away top talent. Our turnover rate in engineering is 43% compared to an industry average of 18%. The cost of recruiting and training replacements is approximately $3.7 million annually. We've lost bids on contracts because our best engineers have gone to competitors. Salesforce hired 5 of our senior developers last year alone, taking $2.1 million in institutional knowledge with them. Catherine Lloyd was making calculations on her notepad. If I'm following correctly, Richard's misconduct has cost this company approximately $60 million in direct theft, lost revenue, and operational inefficiency over 7 years. Is that accurate? Conservative estimate, Marcus Chen interjected. We believe the actual figure is closer to $75 million when you account for the reputational damage and the deflated stock value caused by artificially suppressed earnings reports. This is insane, Richard burst out, ignoring his attorney's restraining hand. I built this company. When I became CEO in 2001, we were doing $89 million in revenue. Last year, we hit $340 million. I've grown this company nearly 4 times. You've ridden the tech boom while actively sabotaging the company's potential, David corrected. The industry has grown 600% in that same period. If Morrison Tech had simply kept pace with competitors, we should be doing $820 million in annual revenue. You haven't grown this company, Richard. You've held it back while personally enriching yourself at shareholder expense. Margaret Sato closed her folder with a decisive snap. I've heard enough. Mr. Hastings, you are terminated as CEO effective immediately. This board will vote on interim leadership and on whether to refer these findings to federal authorities. Mr. Morrison, thank you for bringing this to our attention, regardless of the personal history involved. You can't fire me, Richard shouted, his composure finally shattering completely. I have a contract. I have $2.3 million in unvested stock options. You have a termination for cause clause, Catherine Lloyd said calmly, which voids your severance package, your stock options, and any remaining contractual obligations. Given the evidence of embezzlement and fraud, you're lucky we're not having you arrested right now. Lawrence Patel was whispering urgently in Richard's ear, but Richard shook him off. He turned to David, and there was genuine hatred in his eyes now. This is about your father, isn't it? This is about what happened in 2001. Your father was unstable, David. He was paranoid, erratic. My father was right, David said quietly. He suspected you were stealing from the company, and you had him declared mentally incompetent to shut him up. You paid Dr. Kenneth Brandt $75,000 to falsify a psychiatric evaluation. We have the bank records, Richard. We have Dr. Brandt's testimony. He came forward last year, before Thomas died, because the guilt was eating him alive. We have everything. The room had gone completely silent. Gerald Whitmore looked like he might cry. Margaret Sato was staring at Richard with undisguised disgust. James Brennan had pulled out his phone and was already texting someone, his firm's attorneys probably, preparing for the inevitable shareholder lawsuits. My father spent 7 years trying to clear his name, David continued, his voice steady despite the emotion churning in his chest. 7 years fighting lawyers he couldn't afford, facing people who thought he was crazy, watching his reputation be destroyed by your lies. The stress killed him, Richard. He died at 52 of a massive heart attack because you broke him. And my uncle Thomas, he sacrificed any chance at his own family, his own legacy, to make sure you'd eventually face justice. He died of pancreatic cancer 8 months ago, but he died knowing I'd finish what he started. He died knowing the Morrison family would take back what you stole. Richard's attorney was pulling him toward the door now, recognizing that nothing good could come from staying. My client has no further comment at this time. Any future communication should go through my office. One more thing, Mr. Patel, David called out as they reached the conference room door. The IRS is expecting Richard to make himself available for an interview on Monday, March 18th, at 10 a.m. at their Seattle field office. The $12 million in unreported offshore income constitutes tax evasion. The penalty is substantial, potentially up to 5 years in federal prison. I'd make sure your client has a good criminal tax attorney. Richard's face had gone from red to white. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the doorframe. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, Lawrence Patel's urgent voice fading into silence. The board members sat in stunned quiet for a long moment. Finally, Gerald Whitmore spoke. David, your uncle was one of my best friends. I failed him, and I failed your father. But I swear to you, this board will make this right. We'll clean house, reform the culture, and honor the values your family built this company on." "Thank you, sir," David said, "but I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for action." Jennifer Morrison should be offered the position of acting CEO while you conduct a search for Richard's permanent replacement. She's earned it through her performance, not through any connection to me. Patricia Thornton should be restored to her position as senior counsel with appropriate back pay. Michael Chen should be promoted to CFO with authority to conduct a complete financial audit. And every single employee who filed a complaint that was buried should receive a personal apology and compensation for the retaliation they suffered. "Agreed," Margaret Sato said immediately. "All in favor?" The vote was unanimous. "There's one more thing," David said quietly. "I want Richard prosecuted. I want the SEC investigation. I want the IRS audit. I want him to face the full consequences of what he's done, not just for my family, but for every employee he abused, every client he drove away, every person whose career he damaged. Justice delayed is not justice denied, not this time." Gerald Whitmore nodded slowly. "The board will cooperate fully with all federal investigations. We'll provide all documentation, all testimony, everything needed to build a case. Richard Hastings will answer for his crimes." David gathered his materials, feeling the weight of 16 years finally begin to lift. "My uncle used to say that revenge is a dish best served with thorough documentation and legal representation. He was right. Thank you for your time." As he walked out of the Morrison Tech building into the bright March morning, David's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "We need to talk. Please come home." Home. Their $675,000 house in Maple Leaf, with its creaky front steps, and the garden Jennifer had planted last spring. The house where they'd planned their future, where they'd talked about having children someday, where they'd built a life together over 12 years of marriage. The house that suddenly felt very far away, like something from another lifetime. David sat in his 2019 Honda Civic, the one he'd bought used for $18,500, the one Richard had mocked at last year's company picnic, and stared at Jennifer's text. He thought about the woman he'd married, the one who'd promised to stand by him through everything. He thought about the woman who'd squeezed his arm in warning every time Richard had humiliated him, who'd chosen her career over defending her husband, who'd let fear override love. And he thought about what came next. Jennifer was sitting at their kitchen table when David arrived home at 11:30 a.m., still wearing the $800 dress from last night's party. She'd clearly been crying. Her makeup was smudged, tissues scattered across the table. But when she looked up at him, her eyes were clear. "They called me 2 hours ago," she said quietly. "Gerald Whitmore. They're offering me the acting CEO position, $425,000 salary, full authority to restructure the executive team. They want an answer by Monday." David set his briefcase down by the door, the leather worn smooth by his uncle's hands over 30 years of carrying it. "Are you going to take it?" "That depends on you," Jennifer said. "That depends on whether we still have a marriage." David pulled out the chair across from her, the same chair where they'd eaten breakfast together for 12 years, where they'd planned vacations and argued about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom and talked about their days. "Jen, I need you to understand something. When I inherited that money from Uncle Thomas, when I bought the controlling shares in Morrison Tech, I had a choice. I could have told you immediately. I could have included you in planning what happened at that party, in preparing for the board meeting. But I didn't, because I needed to know something first." "You needed to know if I'd defend you," Jennifer whispered. "You said that last night." "Not just last night," David corrected gently. "The Christmas party at the Columbia Tower Club, the 4th of July retreat, the quarterly dinner at Canlis. 12 times over 2 years, Jen. 12 times Richard humiliated me in front of your colleagues, and 12 times you stayed silent. Or worse, you warned me to be quiet, to not make a scene, to think about your career." Jennifer's hands were shaking as she reached for another tissue. I was trying to protect us. Richard controlled everything at that company. He could have destroyed my career, blacklisted me in the industry. We needed my income, David. We needed my health insurance, my salary, my... We needed each other, David interrupted. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership. We're supposed to be on the same team. But every time you chose silence, every time you prioritized your career over standing up for me, you were telling me something. You were telling me that our marriage was conditional, that you'd be my wife as long as it didn't cost you anything, as long as it didn't threaten your position or your status or your relationship with Richard. That's not fair, Jennifer protested, tears streaming down her face now. You have no idea how hard it is for women in corporate America. I've spent 15 years fighting for respect, proving I'm not just a diversity hire, dealing with condescending men who assume I slept my way into every promotion. I couldn't afford to be seen as weak, as emotional, as someone who couldn't handle the pressure. I had to be perfect, David. I had to be stronger than any man in that building. I know, David said quietly, and he meant it. I've watched you fight those battles. I've seen how hard you work, how much you've sacrificed. You've earned everything you've achieved, Jen. Nobody can take that away from you. But here's what you need to understand. Richard Hastings used your fear against you. He knew exactly what he was doing when he humiliated me in front of your colleagues. He was testing you, seeing how far he could push, demonstrating his power over both of us. And every time you let it happen, you gave him more power. Jennifer was openly sobbing now, her shoulders shaking. What was I supposed to do? Risk everything I'd worked for? Throw away my career to defend you against some stupid comments? Yes, David said simply. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. Because I would have done it for you. If anyone had treated you the way Richard treated me, I would have walked out of that job, that company, that entire industry to defend you. I would have risked everything because you're my wife, and protecting you matters more than any salary or title or career advancement. The kitchen fell silent except for Jennifer's quiet crying. Outside, their neighbors were mowing lawns, washing cars, living their normal Saturday lives. The contrast felt surreal. Inside their house, a marriage was unraveling, while outside the world continued its mundane routines. The board meeting this morning, David continued, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. Richard was fired, terminated for cause, which means he loses his severance, his stock options, everything. The IRS is investigating him for $12 million in tax evasion. The SEC is opening a case for securities fraud. He'll probably face federal charges. His career is over, his reputation is destroyed, and he'll likely spend the next several years in court or prison. Jennifer looked up, her eyes wide. You destroyed him. No, David corrected. He destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone could see what he'd been doing for the past 7 years. The theft, the fraud, the abuse, the harassment. All I did was shine a light on the truth. Richard's downfall is nobody's fault but his own. And what about me? Jennifer asked quietly. What happens to us? David stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden Jennifer had planted, the roses she'd carefully tended, the herb garden she'd started last spring, the future they'd been building together. I don't know, Jen. I honestly don't know if I can trust you anymore. I know you were scared. I know the pressure you were under was real. But marriage requires courage. And when it mattered most, you chose safety over loyalty. You chose your career over our partnership. I can change, Jennifer said desperately. I can be better. I'll stand up for you. It's not about what you'll do going forward, David interrupted gently. It's about what you've already shown me about who you are. When things got hard, when you had to choose between protecting me and protecting yourself, you chose yourself. Every single time. And I can't unknow that, Jen. I can't unsee it. Jennifer stood up, her dress rustling, her face streaked with tears and ruined makeup. So that's it? 12 years of marriage, gone? Just like that? I didn't say that, David replied. I said I don't know. I need time to figure out if I can forgive this, if we can rebuild trust, if there's a version of our marriage that can survive what I've learned about us. How much time? Jennifer whispered. I don't know that either. David turned away from the window to face her. But here's what I do know. You should take the acting CEO position. You've earned it. You're good at your job, and Morrison Tech needs good leadership right now. The company my father and uncle built deserves to be run with integrity. You can be part of fixing what Richard broke. You can create a culture where people don't have to choose between their careers and their dignity, where employees are valued and respected. You can do real good there, Jen. I don't want it if it means losing you, Jennifer said, but her voice wavered slightly, and David heard the lie in it. She did want it. Of course she did. She'd worked her entire career for an opportunity like this. Then you need to figure out what you really want, David said quietly, because I think maybe you've already chosen. And that's okay, Jen. It's okay to want a successful career. It's okay to prioritize your professional ambitions. But you need to be honest about it, with yourself and with me. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Chen. Board vote completed. Jennifer officially offered acting CEO position. Patricia Thornton restored as senior counsel. Michael Chen promoted to CFO. All employees who filed complaints will receive written apologies and back pay. Federal investigations officially open. Richard's attorney is already negotiating a plea deal. It's done, David. Your father would be proud. David showed Jennifer the text. She read it, fresh tears streaming down her face. He's already trying to plea bargain? It's only been a few hours. Lawrence Patel knows the evidence is overwhelming, David explained. Richard's best option now is to cooperate fully, provide testimony about his co-conspirators if there are any, and hope for a reduced sentence. He'll probably serve 2 to 3 years in federal prison, pay massive fines and restitution, and never work in corporate America again. My uncle would have called it proportional justice. What about Sandra Reeves? Jennifer asked. What happens to her? She gets immunity in exchange for her testimony, David said. She was a victim too, Jen. Richard used his power to coerce her into a relationship and then paid her off to protect himself. She deserves a chance to rebuild her life without the weight of his crimes on her conscience. Jennifer nodded slowly, processing everything. The employees who complained, the ones who were retaliated against, they're really getting compensation? Full back pay for lost wages, written apologies from the board, and guaranteed no retaliation going forward. Patricia Thornton alone is getting $175,000 in compensation, plus her original salary and position restored. It's not just about punishing Richard, Jen. It's about making things right for everyone he hurt. I could have been one of them, Jennifer said quietly. If I'd stood up to him, if I'd filed a complaint. You would have been fired or forced out, David agreed, just like the others. That's why toxic workplace cultures persist, because people like Richard make it too dangerous to speak up. But you have a chance now to change that. You can create a company culture where people don't have to be afraid, where speaking truth to power doesn't end careers. You can honor what my father and uncle originally built. Jennifer walked over to him, her movements slow and hesitant. I'm so sorry, David. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I'm sorry I chose my fear over our marriage. I'm sorry I let you down when you needed me most. David looked at his wife, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in months. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the stress lines around her mouth, the weight of carrying fear and ambition and compromise for so long. He saw the woman he'd fallen in love with 13 years ago at a coffee shop in the University District. And he also saw the woman who'd stood silent while Richard humiliated him 12 times. Both versions were true. Both versions were real. I know you're sorry, he said gently, but I need you to understand something. Sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't rebuild trust. Sorry doesn't change the fundamental truth that when our marriage was tested, it failed. We failed. And I don't know if we can fix that. So what do we do? Jennifer asked, her voice barely audible. You accept the acting CEO position, David said. You move into that corner office on Monday morning. You start building the company culture you always wished existed. And I'm going to take some time to figure out what I want. I'm going to visit Uncle Thomas's grave in Lakeview Cemetery and tell him we did it. We took back the company. I'm going to sort through his papers and learn more about my father's time at Morrison Tech. And I'm going to think about whether I can forgive you, whether we can start over, whether our marriage is worth saving. Can I ask you something? Jennifer said. If you decide it's not worth saving, if you decide to leave, will you still let me be CEO? Or will you use your controlling shares to push me out like Richard pushed out your father? David felt a flash of anger at the question, but then he understood. She was still thinking like someone who worked for Richard Hastings, still expecting vindictive retaliation, still unable to imagine a world where power could be wielded with integrity. Jen, he said quietly, I would never use my ownership of the company to control you or punish you or force you out. That would make me exactly like Richard, and I watched what that kind of behavior did to my father, to this company, to dozens of employees. If our marriage ends, it will be because we couldn't rebuild trust, not because I'm holding your career hostage. The board offered you that position because you're qualified, because you've earned it. It has nothing to do with being my wife. Relief flooded Jennifer's face, and David felt a deep sadness wash over him. She'd actually believed he might retaliate against her. After 12 years of marriage, she genuinely feared he would use his power to hurt her. What did that say about them? What did that say about the trust that should have been the foundation of their relationship? I should go, David said, picking up his briefcase. I'm going to stay at the Marriott Courtyard downtown for a few days. Give us both some space to think. David, wait. Jennifer reached for his arm, then let her hand drop. Thank you for the CEO position, for not destroying Richard out of pure revenge, for trying to fix the company instead of just burning it all down, for being better than he was. I had a good example, David said. My father, even after everything Richard did to him, never stopped believing in doing the right thing. He died trying to clear his name because integrity mattered more to him than comfort. And Uncle Thomas spent 15 years building a case the right way, with evidence and documentation and legal process, instead of just retaliating. They taught me that justice and revenge aren't the same thing. He walked to the door, then paused. One more thing, Jen. When you walk into that corner office on Monday morning, when you sit behind that desk and look out at the view my father loved, remember why you're there. Remember all the people who were hurt by Richard's leadership. Remember the employees who were too afraid to speak up, who swallowed their dignity to keep their jobs. And remember that with great power comes great responsibility. You have a chance to be the leader they deserve. Don't waste it. Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face again. I won't. I promise. David walked out into the bright March afternoon, into a future that suddenly looked very different than the one he'd imagined when he woke up yesterday morning. He had $5 million left after purchasing the Morrison Tech shares, enough to never work again if he chose, enough to start a new life anywhere in the world, enough to be truly free for the first time in his life. As he drove toward downtown, his phone rang. Gerald Whitmore. David, I wanted to let you know that the board has been discussing your role in the company going forward, Gerald said. Your uncle left you majority control, but we'd like you to consider taking a more active role. Chairman of the board, perhaps, or even a position on the executive team. You have the Morrison vision, and frankly, we need that right now. David pulled into the parking lot of Lakeview Cemetery, where Uncle Thomas and his father were both buried. Can I think about it, Gerald? I appreciate the offer, but I need some time to figure out what I really want. Of course, take all the time you need. And David, thank you. What you've done this weekend, exposing Richard, protecting the employees, giving this company a chance to heal. It's exactly what Thomas hoped you'd do. He'd be very proud. David ended the call and walked through the cemetery until he found the Morrison family plot. His father's headstone was simple. Robert James Morrison, 1956 to 2008, beloved son, brother, husband, and father, a man of integrity. Thomas's grave was next to it, the earth still fresh. Thomas Richard Morrison, 1954 to 2023. He kept the faith. David sat on the ground between them, feeling the sun warm on his face, the breeze carrying the scent of cherry blossoms from the trees that lined the cemetery paths. "We did it," he said quietly. "Richard's finished. The company's safe. Dad, your name is cleared. Gerald Whitmore is going to make a public statement about the psychiatric evaluation being fraudulent, about Richard's lies. Everyone will know you were right. Uncle Thomas, your plan worked perfectly. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy, it all came together exactly the way you designed it." He sat there for a long time, talking to the two men who'd shaped his life, feeling their presence in the wind and the silence. He told them about the board meeting, about Richard's arrest, about Jennifer's promotion and the difficult conversation they'd had. He told them about the choice he faced now, whether to forgive, whether to rebuild, whether to stay in Seattle or start over somewhere new. "I wish I could ask you what to do," David said finally, "but I think I already know what you'd say. Dad, you'd tell me that marriage requires forgiveness, that everyone makes mistakes, that love is worth fighting for. And Uncle Thomas, you'd tell me that sometimes the bravest thing is walking away, that I don't owe anyone my happiness, that I've earned the right to choose myself." A couple walked past on the path, the woman carrying flowers, the man with his arm around her shoulders. They looked comfortable together, like they'd been married for decades, like they'd weathered storms and come out stronger. David wondered if he and Jennifer would ever look like that, if they could ever rebuild what Richard's toxicity and Jennifer's fear had broken. His phone buzzed again. "Jennifer, I love you. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But I hope you can find a way to forgive me. I hope we can find a way back to each other. You're the best man I've ever known, and I'm so sorry I didn't show you that when it mattered." David stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I love you too, but love isn't always enough. I need time. Please give me that." Her response came immediately. "All the time you need. I'll be here." 2 months later, on a warm evening in mid-May, David stood in the Morrison Tech conference room, the same room where Richard had been fired, where his father had once worked, where Uncle Thomas's legacy had been reclaimed. The company had changed dramatically in 8 weeks. Patricia Thornton had implemented new HR policies protecting whistleblowers. Michael Chen had completed a financial audit revealing an additional $3.2 million in irregularities that would be recovered. Jennifer had restructured the executive team, promoted from within, and started a company-wide training program on ethical leadership. The Seattle Times had run a front-page story. "Tech company scandal. Former CEO arrested for $12 million fraud." Richard had pled guilty to embezzlement and tax evasion in exchange for a recommended sentence of 3 years in federal prison. He'd paid $8.7 million in restitution so far, liquidating assets and selling his Mercer Island estate for $3.2 million to cover part of what he owed. David had spent those 2 months in therapy, working through his feelings about Jennifer, about his father's legacy, about what he wanted his life to look like going forward. He'd had dinner with Jennifer twice, awkward, careful conversations over Italian food at their favorite restaurant, dancing around the big questions, rebuilding connection one small step at a time. And now he stood in the profile as the board voted unanimously to appoint Jennifer Morrison as permanent CEO of Morrison Tech Solutions. No longer acting, no longer provisional. She'd earned it through her leadership, through her integrity, through the changes she'd implemented that were already showing results. Employee satisfaction up 34%. Client retention improving. 3 major contracts renewed. Congratulations, Jen, Gerald Whitmore said, shaking her hand. You've proven yourself beyond any doubt. Robert and Thomas Morrison would be honored to see you leading this company. Jennifer smiled, but her eyes found David's across the room. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. She'd done well. She'd stepped into an impossible situation and handled it with grace and competence. Whatever happened with their marriage, he was genuinely proud of her. After the board members left, after the champagne toast and the handshakes and the promises to rebuild Morrison Tech into the company it should have always been, David and Jennifer stood alone in the conference room as the sun set over Elliott Bay. "Can we talk?" Jennifer asked quietly. Of course. They sat at the conference table, the same chairs they'd occupied 2 months ago when everything had exploded. "I've been in therapy," Jennifer said, "working on understanding why I made the choices I did, why I prioritized fear over love, why I couldn't find the courage to stand up for you when it mattered." "That's good," David said. "I've been in therapy too, trying to figure out if I can forgive you, if I can trust you again, if we have a foundation to build on." "Have you figured it out?" Jennifer asked, and her voice trembled slightly. David was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I've figured out that what you did was human. It was flawed and hurtful and disappointing, but it was human. You were scared, and fear makes people do things they're not proud of. I've also figured out that I can forgive you. I think I already have, actually. But forgiveness doesn't automatically mean reconciliation. We can't go back to who we were before all this happened, Jen. That marriage is gone." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I know. I've known that for a while now." "But," David continued, "maybe we can build something new, something better, something based on the truth about who we both really are. You with your ambition and your drive and your fear, me with my need for loyalty and my tendency to test people instead of just communicating. Maybe we can be more honest this time, more vulnerable, more willing to fight for each other even when it's hard." "You want to try again?" Jennifer asked, hope flickering across her face. "I want to try something," David said carefully. "I'm not moving back into the house right away. I think we need to date again, like we're starting over. Get to know each other as the people we are now, not the people we thought we were marrying 13 years ago. Go slow, build trust gradually, and if it works, if we can create something real and solid and honest, then maybe we have a future together." "And if it doesn't work," Jennifer whispered. "Then we end things with dignity and respect," David said gently. "We split our assets fairly, we support each other's futures from a distance, and we remember that we had something good once, even if it couldn't survive everything we went through." Jennifer wiped her eyes, smudging her mascara the way she always did when she cried. "When did you get so wise?" "Uncle Thomas," David said with a small smile. "He left me letters along with everything else. Letters about marriage and forgiveness and justice and integrity. One of them said, 'The mark of a good person isn't perfection. It's how they respond when they fail. Give people room to prove who they really are, but don't be afraid to walk away if they prove they're not who you need them to be.'" "That sounds like Thomas," Jennifer said. "He always had a way with words." She stood up, smoothing her dress. "So, would you like to have dinner with me this weekend? There's a new restaurant in Capitol Hill I've been wanting to try. We could date." "I'd like that," David said, standing as well. "Friday night?" "Friday night," Jennifer confirmed. They walked out of Morrison Tech together, into the warm May evening, into the uncertainty of a future that could go 100 different ways. David didn't know if their marriage would survive. He didn't know if they could rebuild what had been broken. But he knew he was willing to try, willing to take the risk, willing to believe that sometimes second chances actually worked. 3 months later, Richard Hastings was sentenced to 42 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $12.3 million in restitution. He'd lost his home, his reputation, his career, and most of his assets. The last David heard, Richard was appealing the sentence, but legal experts gave him zero chance of success. The evidence had been overwhelming. Justice, slow but thorough, had prevailed. Morrison Tech Solutions was thriving under Jennifer's leadership. Revenue up 18% year over year, employee satisfaction at an all-time high. Patricia Thornton had been promoted to general counsel. Michael Chen had discovered an additional $4.1 million in recoverable assets. The company was healing, slowly but surely, from the damage Richard had inflicted. And David and Jennifer were trying. They had dinner twice a week. They went to couples therapy every Thursday. They were honest with each other in ways they'd never been before, about their fears, their resentments, their hopes, their doubts. Some days were good, some days were hard, but they were building something new, something more authentic, something that might actually last. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. David learned that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's letting people face the consequences of their own actions while you focus on building something better. He learned that justice and healing take time, that marriages can survive failure if both people are willing to do the work, and that the legacy we leave isn't measured in money or power, but in how we treat people when we have the chance to either help or hurt them. His father had taught him integrity. His uncle had taught him patience. And Jennifer, through her failures and her efforts to make amends, was teaching him that forgiveness is a choice you make every single day, not just once. Sometimes the best outcome isn't perfect. Sometimes it's just enough. And sometimes David was learning, enough is exactly what you need.